The prince was supposed to choose a princess. That was the king's command. But he chose a servant instead, the woman he had loved his entire life, and that choice would cost them everything. She had worked in his castle her entire life. She had never asked for anything. She had never broken a law, stolen a coin, or spoken out of place. She had simply done her work, kept her head down, and loved a man she was not supposed to love. And for that, the king sentenced her to death. By the time the great hall fell silent, her feet were bare on the cold stone. Her hair had come loose. Her dress was torn at the shoulder where a guard had grabbed her too hard. She kept her chin up. The man she loved stood 3 steps away, hands bound, jaw tight, eyes locked on her and no one else. There was no fear in his face, only something that looked like grief. The king did not rise from his throne. He looked at her the way a man looks at a broken piece of furniture, with mild inconvenience, and said the words that silenced the room. She will be executed at dawn. No trial, no testimony, no mercy. And the question that settled over the room like smoke, the question no one dared say aloud, was the same one burning behind her eyes. Had any of it been worth it? It had started, as most impossible things do, with a ball. The kingdom of Aldenmere had been bleeding for 3 years. Not from war, though war was coming. It bled from the inside, from its own hands. King Aldric III had a talent for spending money that did not exist. Tapestries from the southern continent, feasts lasting 7 days, a glass conservatory built in the North Tower that no one ever used. The treasury was not merely empty. It owed debts to 4 foreign houses, 2 merchant guilds, and 1 very patient cardinal who had stopped being patient sometime around the previous winter. The people knew. That was the thing about the kingdom's poverty. It was not hidden. You could see it in the village markets that thinned every season, in the roads that were not repaired, in the faces of the men who came back from the eastern borders, half-fed and told no one had sent provisions. The people of Aldenmere did not love their king. They endured him. They counted the years between him and the son who would follow, and they waited. They loved the prince. They had reasons for this. He had ridden into the eastern villages himself 3 winters ago to assess the damage after the floods, not with a retinue of 50, but with 4 men and 2 carts of grain. He had sat in people's homes. He had eaten their bread. He had looked at the collapsed mill and said very simply that it would be rebuilt and that he would see to it personally. It was rebuilt. He had seen to it. The people of Aldenmere knew the difference between a king who spoke of duty and a man who practiced it. They had one of each. They knew which one would outlast the other. The solution to the kingdom's ruin, as the royal advisers explained it to Prince Edric, was simple. He would marry. Specifically, he would marry Princess Isadora of the House of Varenthal, a wealthy northern dynasty with enough gold to silence every creditor and enough soldiers to discourage every enemy. Isadora was said to be clever, composed, and not unkind. The alliance would be immediate. The wedding could happen within a fortnight. All Edric had to do was choose her at the Grand Autumn Ball, held that Friday evening in front of the assembled court. He was 32 years old. He understood duty. He had been understanding duty since he was old enough to walk in a straight line and bow at the correct angle. He told himself it would be fine. He told himself this the way a man tells himself a wound is not deep, with great conviction and declining certainty. He told himself this right up until the moment he walked past the kitchen corridor and heard her voice. She was arguing with someone. She did that sometimes, spoke in a low, steady tone that somehow carried more authority than shouting, the kind of voice that made people reconsider their decisions. The kitchen was her domain, the same way it had been her mother's domain before her. She had grown up in these walls the same as he had. Her name was Mara. She was the head cook's daughter, and then, after her mother died, she became the head cook herself. She ran the castle kitchens with the quiet competence of someone who had never needed a title to lead. The staff respected her. The guards liked her. The old women who did the linens called her sharp but fair. She was 28 years old, and she had brown eyes and a way of looking at a person that made them feel seen down to their foundations. Edric had been in love with her for most of his life. He knew it was impossible. He had always known. He had also known, at various points in his life, that the sky is a particular shade of violet just before a storm, that the old pear tree in the south garden blooms 2 weeks before everything else, and that some things are simply true regardless of whether they are convenient. He stopped in the corridor. She came out of the kitchen carrying a tray, nearly walked into him, caught the tray and looked up. "Your Highness," she said, the way she always said it, not cold, not warm, somewhere precisely in between, the way you speak to someone you have known long enough to be honest with. Mara, a beat of silence, the kind that holds too much. The ball starts in an hour, she said. I know. She looked at him steadily. She had gotten better at this over the years, at keeping her expression arranged, at not letting anything show in front of other people. He had watched her practice this composure, the way you watch someone build a wall around something they are trying to protect. You should go get ready, she said. I know that too. She shifted the tray slightly. Is there something you needed, my lord? There were 100 things he needed. He said none of them. He nodded once, stepped aside, and watched her walk down the corridor with the same steady, unhurried pace she always had. He stood there for a moment after she had gone. Then he went to the ball. The great hall was magnificent. Whatever Aldrich III lacked in wisdom or restraint, he possessed an extraordinary eye for pageantry. The hall had been dressed in deep gold and dark burgundy. 100 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead. Musicians played from the gallery. Ladies in silk moved across the floor like bright birds. Princess Isidora of Varenthal stood near the far end of the room with her attendants. She was tall, fair-haired, composed in the way that people are composed when they have been trained since childhood to never show distress. She glanced at Edric when he entered. He looked back. They shared a brief, courteous nod, two people who understood exactly what this evening was and what it required of them. He crossed the room. He spoke with her for a quarter of an hour. She was, as reported, intelligent. She had opinions about grain taxation and northern border fortification. She spoke 3 languages. She did not pretend to be in love with him, and he respected her for that. I imagine this is not how either of us pictured this, she said at one point carefully, watching his face. No, he said honestly. She nodded slowly. Well, here we are. He was about to respond when he saw Mara across the room. She was not supposed to be here. She was kitchen staff and the ball was not her domain. But one of the serving girls had apparently taken ill, and she had stepped in to carry trays of wine through the hall. She moved through the crowd with her eyes down, the way you move when you are trying to take up no space to pass unnoticed. She was wearing her plain grey dress. Her hair was pinned up. She had the necklace at her throat. A simple thing, a rough copper bead on a leather cord, the kind of thing a child might make. Edric had made it. When he was 9 years old, in the south garden, with a piece of wire and a bead, he had traded for 3 of his lesson marbles. He had put it around her neck himself and told her it was forever. She was 28 years old, and she still wore it. He excused himself from Princess Isidora. He told himself he was simply going to say good evening, a brief word, nothing more. He was not a reckless man. He understood what was at stake. He crossed the room and touched her elbow gently, just enough to get her attention. She turned. Surprise moved across her face, quickly followed by something else, a rapid internal calculation, the reading of the room, an awareness of who was watching. Edric, she said very quietly. Not my lord, his name. Walk with me, he said. Just for a moment, the side corridor. She should have said no, he should not have asked. Both of them knew this. She followed him anyway. They stood in the small corridor off the east side of the hall, a narrow stone passage lit by a single sconce, and for one long moment neither of them said anything. He looked at her. She looked at him. The music drifted through the wall, muffled and distant. You should go back in there, she said. I know. She seems like a decent person. The princess. She is. Mara looked down at the tray she was still holding. Her jaw tightened slightly. Then go choose her. Choose her and end this, Edric. It's the right thing. Is it? For the kingdom? Yes. And for you? She looked up sharply. Don't. Mara, don't ask me that. It isn't fair. Her voice was steady, but something behind her eyes was not. You made a choice when you were born. I made a choice when my mother died and I stayed. We both knew what this was. We both know what it can't be. He reached out and touched the cord at her throat very gently, one finger against the copper bead. She went very still. I promised you, he said, when I was 9 years old. You were a child. I meant it. Edric. Her voice dropped even lower. There are people on the other side of that wall who will destroy you if they see us. Who will destroy me? You know that. He did know that. He had always known that. He kissed her anyway. It was not the first time. It was, they had told each other multiple times, supposed to be the last time, but it was the first time someone saw them. The door at the end of the corridor opened. The light fell in. And Lord Brennan, the king's closest advisor, a thin, watchful man with the instincts of a hunting dog, stood in the doorway and did not move for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the great hall. They were brought before the king within the hour. The ball did not stop. That was the detail Mara remembered afterward. In the darkness of the prison cell, the music had kept playing while they were escorted through the corridors. Someone out there was still dancing. King Aldrich sat on his throne looking deeply, personally offended. He was 58, heavy-jowled, flushed from wine and indignation. He had the look of a man who had never once, in his entire life, been denied anything, and was not prepared to start now. The lords who lined the hall watched in silence. Some of them looked away, not from shame, from calculation. This was the kind of moment you survived by becoming invisible. Some of the older ones, the ones who had served before Aldrich came to power, stared at the floor with the particular expression of men who had learned long ago that objecting to him cost more than it changed. He looked at Mara the way you look at an object that has caused you inconvenience, not hatred, something worse. Simple dismissal. Her name, he said to Brennan. Mara, sire. Daughter of the late cook, Clara. Kitchen staff. Remove the necklace, the king said. A guard stepped forward. Mara gripped the cord instinctively, and the guard paused. Leave it, Edric said, his voice hard. The king looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved in his eyes that was not quite emotion, more like the recognition of a problem. You were to choose a bride tonight, the king said. You were to secure the alliance. Instead, you are standing in my hall with your hands on a kitchen girl, and half the court saw you escorted in together. He paused. Do you understand what you have done? I understand what you are about to do, Edric said, and I am asking you not to. You will marry Princess Isadora tomorrow. The king said it the way you state a mathematical fact, and this woman will be executed at dawn. The silence that followed had a physical weight. One of the older lords near the far wall, a man named Aldous, who had served before Aldrich and had watched the kingdom hollow out year by year, closed his eyes briefly. A young soldier at the door stared straight ahead with the rigidity of someone fighting a visible battle against his own face. They all heard it. They all stayed quiet. That was what Aldrich had always relied on. Not loyalty, but the exhausted silence of people who had learned that speaking cost too much. She has done nothing, Edric said. The calm in his voice was the most frightening thing about it. She is a servant in your castle. She owes you obedience and labor. She has given you both. She is not your subject to execute. She is exactly that, the king said, as is every soul within these walls. He leaned forward slightly. You have embarrassed this house in front of every lord in the kingdom. You have jeopardized the only alliance that stands between us and ruin. And you did it for this. He gestured toward Mara with one pale hand. A cook's daughter. Mara did not flinch. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and she did not let them see a single thing. Father, Edric began. Guards, the king said. Take them both. The cell was in the lower keep. Dark, cold, silent. Mara sat against the stone wall and breathed. She touched the necklace. And just like that, without asking permission, the memory came. She was 7 years old, and she was crying. Not loudly. She had already learned by 7 that loud crying accomplished nothing in a castle full of people with more important concerns. She sat under the pear tree in the south garden, knees pulled to her chest, because her mother had shouted at her for breaking a ceramic bowl, and she had felt the unfairness of it so acutely that it pressed behind her eyes like something solid. He had come from around the hedge. He was 9, already taller than her, and he had the particular earnestness of children who have been told since birth that they are responsible for things. Why are you crying? He asked. I'm not, she said, though she clearly was. He sat down next to her without being invited. He picked up a piece of wire from somewhere, she never knew where it came from, and began bending it into a loop. He found a bead in his pocket. He threaded the wire. His tongue stuck out slightly while he worked. He held it out to her when it was done. What is this? She asked. It's forever, he said with the complete confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt his own declarations. She had put it on. One day, he had told her, that afternoon under the pear tree. When I am king, I will change the laws. Royals should marry for love. It doesn't matter what family you come from. I'm going to change it. She had looked at him. She was 7 and practical, and she already understood on some bone-deep level the architecture of the world she lived in. You can't change a law like that, she said. I can. I will. Just because you want to? Because it's right, he said simply. Wrong things should be changed. That's what kings are for. She had not believed him. She had loved him and not believed him, which is its own kind of sorrow, and she had kept the necklace anyway because some promises are worth holding on to even when you doubt them. She held the copper bead in her palm now. She thought about the word dawn and what it meant. She was not going to fall apart. She decided this clearly and without drama. She would not fall apart because falling apart was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and she was not about to start now. But she sat in the dark for a very long time, and she held the necklace and she let herself grieve quietly and without witness the life she had wanted and would not have. The guard who came in the middle of the night was not there to take her to her execution. His name was Thomas. He was 24, square-shouldered, had known Mara since they were both children running through the same castle corridors. He looked frightened, which was unusual for him. "Come with me," he whispered. "Where?" "Away from here." He glanced at the door. "The prince asked me, before they put him under house arrest. He asked me if I had ever called him friend to get you out." She stood slowly. "And what about you? When they find the cell empty?" "I'll be gone by then. My brother has a farm 3 days east." He offered something that was almost a smile. "Come on." They moved through the castle the way ghosts move, through the kitchens first, which Mara knew better than anyone alive. Every door, every passage, every gap, where a wall met a floor. They had almost reached the dairy door when they heard footsteps, heavy ones. 2 guards coming from the east corridor. Thomas pressed flat against the wall. Mara stopped breathing. The steps came closer, 15 feet, 10, 8, and then paused. A lantern light swelled under the door beside them. A voice, low and muffled, said something she couldn't make out. Then the steps turned. The lantern light receded. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Thomas exhaled through his teeth very quietly and jerked his head toward the dairy door. They went through it fast, out through the lower yard. Too open, too much moonlight, every shadow a threat. Mara kept her eyes on the east wall and moved without hesitating because hesitation was the thing that got you caught. Halfway across the yard, a door opened behind them. A single figure stood in the frame, one of the night porters half asleep holding a candle. He looked toward them. Mara did not stop walking. She kept her pace exactly even, exactly unhurried, as if she had every right to be exactly where she was. The porter looked at her for a long moment. Then he went back inside and closed the door. Through the gap in the east wall, 11 years unrepaired, God willing still unrepaired. It was. Barely. Mara went through sideways, stone scraping her shoulder. Then the cold hit her. Night air full of autumn, sharp with the smell of the river. The stars were very bright. Thomas had a horse waiting at the tree line. He helped her mount, handed her a sack with bread and a blanket and 3 silver coins, and then looked at her with something she recognized as helpless regret. "Is he all right?" she asked. "He will be," Thomas said. "He's the prince. They won't hurt him. But you—" He stopped. "You need to go far, Mara. Don't come back." She nodded once. She looked at the castle walls, the place she had been born in, more or less, the place that had been her entire world for 28 years. Then she turned the horse east and rode into the dark. 3 weeks later, in a farmhouse near the edge of a nameless forest, she learned she was pregnant. She sat with this information for a long time. She sat with it the way you sit with something very heavy, not trying to move it, not trying to make it smaller, just adjusting to its weight. A child, Edric's child. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. Outside, it was raining. The child would need food. The child would need safety. The child would need a name and a place and a life that had nothing to do with thrones or crowns or the particular sorrow of impossible promises. Mara made a decision, the way she always made decisions, quietly, practically, without drama. She would not go back. She would not send word. She would build something small and real and hers, and she would give this child a life that did not require anyone to save them. She touched the necklace. She kept it on. Months passed. Then more months. Then a year. She had moved twice, first further east, then south, to a larger village where she found work in a tavern kitchen. She was good at her work, as she had always been. The innkeeper valued her. She made friends slowly, carefully, the way you make friends when you are carrying a secret. She told people she was a widow. It was close enough to true. Her son was born in the spring. She named him Thomas, after the guard who had gotten her out, and he had Edric's eyes. She had expected this to be a daily wound. It was, sometimes. Mostly it was simply a fact, the way the sky was a certain color, or the river ran a certain direction. She did not think about Oldenmere. She told herself this every morning. She had no way of knowing what had happened, whether the marriage to Isadora had gone through. whether the debts had been settled, whether the kingdom still stood, and she was not sure knowing would help her. But the nights were different from the mornings. Late at night, when Thomas was asleep and the tavern was quiet and there was nothing to keep her hands busy, she thought about Edric with a longing so specific it had weight. Not the grand romantic ache of stories, something smaller and more honest. She thought about the way he stood when he was trying not to show he was worried, one hand at his side and the other pressed flat against his thigh. She thought about the afternoon he had brought grain to the eastern villages himself, the mud on his boots when he came back, the way he had sat at her kitchen table for 1 hour and not spoken about any of it, just eaten the bread she gave him. She thought, is he all right? She thought, did they force him to marry her? She thought, does he know about the child? And then she stopped herself from thinking that last one, because it led nowhere useful. She thought sometimes that she had done the right thing by leaving. She thought other times that she had done the coward's thing, that there was a difference between protecting yourself and simply running from something that frightened you. She had run. She knew that. She held the necklace and she looked at her sleeping son, and she let herself wonder, just for a moment, whether the man she loved was still the man she had always believed him to be. She didn't know. She wouldn't know here. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she started making arrangements. The word reached the village on an autumn morning, carried by a merchant who had come from the capital road. King Aldric was dead. He had died of fever, with no dramatic last words and no reconciliations. He had simply gotten sick, and then sicker, and then stopped. The merchant said the castle bells had rung for him, and the people had stood in the streets in the particular silence of those who are not sure whether to mourn or breathe. A woman at the market stall next to Mara crossed herself. Then, almost immediately, the woman next to her said very quietly, God rest him, and God help whoever comes next. There was a murmur of agreement. Not grief, something closer to weary hope. The merchant added more. The prince had not yet appeared. No one knew where he was. The court was in disarray. The creditors were circling. Some lords were already positioning for influence. Mara heard all of this from the market basket she was holding. Thomas was 18 months old. He was walking now, unsteadily, with great determination, and a habit of picking up objects that were not meant for him and examining them with an expression of grave scientific interest. She heard the news and kept walking. But that night, after she had put Thomas to bed and sat alone in the small room with the single candle, she held the necklace and she thought very carefully about promises, about what they cost, about what it meant that she had spent a year hiding from a promise that had never, as far as she knew, been broken. She thought about his eyes in the corridor outside the ball, the clarity in them, the absolute, impractical, inconvenient certainty. She thought about her son's eyes, which were identical. She thought about the woman at the market who had said, God help whoever comes next, and the hope underneath those words, that careful, exhausted hope of people who had been waiting a long time for something to change. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark. Then she started making arrangements. The journey to Aldenmere took 9 days. She travelled with a merchant caravan for safety. Thomas tied to her chest in a linen wrap for the first 4 days, and on her hip for the last 5. He was largely indifferent to the inconvenience of travel. He observed the world from his position against her ribs, with the same grave interest he brought to everything. She did not know what she was going back to. She was not, she told herself firmly, going back for him. She was going back because she had spent too long running from a thing that was also hers, because her son had a right to exist in the world without being hidden, because she had made something out of nothing, and she was not ashamed of it, and she was tired of acting as though she were. She was going back because some promises deserved to be witnessed. The capital was visible from the road 2 hours before she reached it, the familiar towers, the river glinting at the base of the hill. She had not expected it to feel like anything. It felt like a hand around her ribs squeezing gently. She arrived on the morning of the ceremony. The great hall had been laid out for mourning and transition, black and gold, the colours of passage. Lords and ladies stood in rows, their faces arranged in the formal expressions of political uncertainty. The throne was empty. There was a tension in the room that Mara recognized from the ball 1 year prior, that specific vibration of events held suspended, waiting for the thing that would tip them one way or another. She stood at the back of the hall, near the servants' entrance. No one had stopped her. She knew these corridors. She knew every face among the domestic staff, and they knew hers. The girl who had taken her kitchen post looked at her with wide eyes, and then, wordlessly, moved aside. Thomas regarded the hall from her arms with his usual careful attention. She waited. The doors at the far end opened, not the small doors on the sides, the great doors, the ones at the front of the hall, which faced the courtyard, which opened outward toward the city. They opened inward now. Light came in first, then wind, then a figure that the hall knew, that every person in the room recognized in the specific, physical way you recognize someone whose absence you have been carrying. Edric walked in alone. He was not dressed in mourning. He was dressed plainly in dark traveling clothes, as if he had been riding and had not stopped. He was thinner than she remembered. Something in his face had changed. Not aged, exactly. Deepened. The way a person looks when they have lived through the thing they were most afraid of and come out the other side still standing. The hall was absolutely silent. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. The lord who had been managing affairs, an older man named Cassian who had advised 3 kings with varying success, stepped forward with a prepared statement and a carefully neutral expression. "My lord," he began, "there are matters of succession that require—" "I know," Edric said. His voice carried. It was quieter than his father's had ever been, and carried further. "I am aware of everything that requires to be done." He looked around the room. "I am aware of what this kingdom needs, and what it has been denied, and what I owe the people in this room and the people outside these walls." He paused. "I will sit on that throne, but I will sit on it under the following condition." Lord Cassian looked as though he had swallowed something uncomfortable. "A decree," Edric said, "to be recorded and witnessed this morning, before I take the crown." He looked at the clerk at the small desk near the wall, who scrambled for parchment. "No heir of this kingdom from this day forward will be required to marry for political alliance. No royal bond will be made under compulsion. The choice of a partner, their name, their blood, their station, will rest with the person who must live that life." He looked around the room once more slowly. "This is not a negotiation." The silence held. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the hall, the older lord named Aldous, the man who had closed his eyes on the night of the sentencing, who had carried that silence like a wound for a year, began to applaud. It was not a polite, cautious applause. It was the kind that starts in the chest and comes out the hands without permission. It moved through the room like fire through dry grass. Not everyone joined. Some lords stood with tight faces and calculating eyes, measuring what this cost them. But the hall itself, the staff, the soldiers at the walls, the young lords who had grown up watching their fathers marry women they didn't choose, those voices filled the vaulted ceiling with something that sounded, to anyone who had ears for it, like relief, like the specific physical relief of people who had been holding their breath for a very long time. Edric waited for the room to settle, and then, because he was looking for her, and because he had been looking for her since the moment he walked in, his eyes found the back of the hall. She was standing near the servants' entrance. She had not moved. She had her chin level and her eyes clear, and her boy on her hip, and she was looking at him with an expression he had been carrying in his memory for over a year. That particular combination of clarity and steadiness, and something too large to name. He saw the necklace. He went very still. She watched him recognize it. She watched the recognition move through him, the copper bead, the leather cord, the small rough thing he had made her under a pear tree 23 years ago, and she watched it break something open in his face that he had been keeping closed for a very long time. He walked across the hall. The court watched in absolute silence. Lord Cassian may have made a sound. No one moved. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the child on her hip, at the eyes that were unmistakably and obviously his own, and he breathed out once, like a man setting down something very heavy. Thomas looked at him with the grave, interested expression he brought to everything new. "You came back," Edric said. "You kept your promise," Mara said. He reached out and touched the necklace gently, one finger against the copper bead. "You kept it," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I never stopped believing in you," she said. "Not really." He looked at her. She looked at him. 23 years of knowing each other, and 2 decades of knowing exactly what the world said was possible, and 1 year of being separated by distance and silence and the particular cruelty of men who measure worth by bloodline. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Edric, in front of everyone," he said. He looked around briefly at the watching court, at the lords with their calculations and the staff with their held breath and the clerk with his fresh parchment. Then he looked back at her. "I want everyone to hear it." She waited. "Mara," he said, "daughter of Clara, who kept this kitchen better than any lord has ever kept a castle. Mother of my son, who has his grandmother's good sense and a habit of picking things up that don't belong to him. Something close to a smile crossed his face. I promised you when we were children that I would change what needed to be changed. I have done that this morning to the extent that I could. He paused. I would like, with your permission and on your terms, to ask you to remain. As what? She said, and her voice did not waver, though something behind her eyes was very bright. As my wife, he said, if you'll have me, as queen of this kingdom, if the kingdom will accept you. He looked around once more at the assembled court. And if they won't, he said it clearly, without drama, without hesitation, then they will need a different king. The silence that followed was the kind that contains everything. And then Lord Cassian, who had served under 3 kings and had outlasted all of them, through the simple strategy of reading rooms correctly, cleared his throat and said in a dry, carrying voice, "The decree has been recorded. It would appear it applies immediately." The room exhaled. Thomas, who had been watching the entire exchange from his mother's hip, with the intense scientific interest he brought to all things, reached out and grabbed a fistful of Edric's traveling coat. Edric looked down at him. Thomas regarded him seriously for a moment. Then he made a small, decided sound of approval and held on. The coronation happened 3 days later. It was smaller than anyone expected, and more honest than any ceremony the kingdom had seen in a generation. Edric stood before his court and his people, and received the crown without theatre, without excess. Mara stood beside him. She wore a dress made in 3 days by the castle seamstresses, who had apparently decided, collectively and without instruction, to do the best work of their careers. It was deep blue, simply cut. She wore no jewels except the necklace, the rough copper bead, the leather cord. The lords who had objected looked at her in the throne room and saw a woman who stood very still and kept her chin level and met every gaze with a calm that was more powerful than any title. Some of them respected this. A few of them began to understand that the kingdom had perhaps accidentally gotten exactly the queen it needed. Thomas sat on the floor beside the throne and tried with great concentration to untie his own shoes. Aldenmere did not transform overnight. The debts were real, and the work of settling them was long and careful and not particularly dramatic. Edric was a different kind of king than his father, slower to declare, quicker to listen. The people had known him all his life. They trusted him the way you trust someone who has shown you over decades that they mean what they say. He reorganized the treasury. He negotiated with the merchant guilds without his father's contempt. He reached out to Princess Isadora of Varenthal, who had returned home the night of the ball, and established a different kind of alliance, one based on trade rather than marriage, which Isadora said she preferred anyway. Mara ran the household the way she had run the kitchens, without drama, without excess, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing what you're doing and not needing anyone to tell you so. She was not what the court had expected. She was better. She had kept a kingdom's cook alive through 3 harvest failures once. She understood from the inside what the kingdom actually needed because she had spent her life in the parts of the castle where the real work happened. She was, it turned out, exactly the kind of queen that a kingdom in the business of rebuilding itself could use. There was an evening, some months after the coronation, when they sat together in the south garden. The pear tree was there, older now, broader, throwing its long shadow across the grass in the late light. Thomas was asleep inside. The castle was quiet, the particular quiet of a place that has stopped holding its breath. Edric looked at the tree for a while. "I used to think," he said, "that keeping a promise was the simple part, that the hard part was having the opportunity to keep it." "And now?" Mara asked. He thought about everything it had cost. The years of knowing and not being able to say, the night of the ball, the corridor, the cell, the year of exile, the morning he had walked back into the great hall and not known, truly not known, whether she would be there. "Now I think the hard part is deciding it's worth the cost," he said, "and then doing it anyway, every day. Not once, every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He touched the necklace, lightly. She let him. "You were right, you know," she said after a moment. "About what? When you were 9, you said wrong things should be changed, that was what kings are for." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a very good teacher," he said. She laughed, a quiet sound, genuine and uncomplicated, the kind that has no performance in it. The pear tree moved slightly in the evening air. Aldenmere had been saved in the end, not by gold borrowed from a distant dynasty, not by soldiers at the border, not by any alliance that required someone to sacrifice the person they were in order to secure it. It had been saved by the specific, impractical, inconvenient insistence of a 9-year-old boy under a pear tree who had decided that a wrong thing was wrong and that he was going to change it, and by the girl who had kept his promise in a leather cord around her neck for 23 years, and by everyone who had stood in that hall and heard the decree and started to applaud. A kingdom is only ever as strong as what it is willing to protect, and what Aldenmere had learned, slowly and at cost, was that the things worth protecting are not always the things that look like power. Sometimes they look like a copper bead on a leather cord. Sometimes they look like a woman standing at the back of a hall with her chin level and her child on her hip, waiting to see whether the man she loves is the man she always believed him to be. He was. He had been. And from that morning forward, so was Aldenmere. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of their waiting, the truth of his promise, the courage it takes to walk back toward the thing you love, leave your rating in the comments below. From 0 to 10, how much did this story touch your heart?